Hello, it's Wednesday, January the 19th, and the lunar nodes, have switched signs. We've been kind of leading up to this for a while, but they finally crossed that point. Now, a couple things before I get into doing these horoscopes that I have planned out here. I'm going to do one for each of the 12 signs. Before I get into that, though, some points to be made about the lunar nodes themselves. First of all, the lunar nodes are not physical objects, but rather they represent the motion of the moon. That the moon kind of does this sort of like up and down, kind of sneaking, curving motion, and that the north node represents the northmost point, and that the south node, or no, it's not the northmost point. It's like the the point the point where the moon crosses the path of the sun coming up versus coming down, basically. And that when the sun is at that position with the moon, that's when you get an eclipse because they're crossing paths. So they're more of these. They're not physical points, and actually, in traditional astrology, there wasn't as much focus on the north nodes. Um, the significance has more to do with the actual eclipses themselves. Um, but I do think I do think it's worthwhile to look at. And if I was looking at a chart and the moon was conjunct with one of the nodes, and it wasn't a an eclipse or anything like that, I would still read into that. If a planet was conjunct the nodes, I would still read that. Which brings me to my next point, which is that Jupiter is in Pisces, and now that the nodes have switched, that they're in the fixed signs, but prior to the nodes switching into Taurus and Scorpio, we had the nodes in Sagittarius and Gemini. And as you know, those are mutable signs, and Pisces is square to Sagittarius and Gemini. Um, and especially at the point where Jupiter first entered Pisces and the nodes were at the nodes moved backwards, so they were at the early degrees of Sagittarius and Gemini. Jupiter has been squaring the nodes from the position which is referred to as the south bending. I just thought I'd throw this in here because the south bending has more to do with the south node, which has more to do with maybe a sense of loss or a sense of detachment, that kind of thing. So that has been flavoring our Jupiter in Pisces for a while. The fact that Jupiter in Pisces has been squaring the nodes. Now Jupiter in Pisces is a few degrees more into Pisces, so it's not quite as strong as when Jupiter first made the ingress. But what was that? That was only a couple of weeks ago. Um, we're only a couple of weeks into January here. I guess I just wanted to go over a few of those things before getting into the actual horoscope reading. I guess I could also talk about just in general. Well, Scorpio and Taurus. You've got the North Node in Taurus, which represents an increase of Taurus-like things. South Node in Scorpio, which represents a decrease of Scorpio-like things. And so, um, I mean, you can think of some of your general stereotypes. Like when I think of a Taurus, I think about food. I think about, those trends of like when the pandemic started and everybody was baking bread and stuff like that, and everybody's starting their own gardens and that kind of thing. Those are all very Taurian kinds of activities. Taurus also rules the throat. And so strong Taurus placements, like Moon in Taurus, is often associated with people who have good singing voices. And so North Node in Taurus may have something to do with something, an increase of vocal expression, maybe, or it's a Venus ruled sign, so it's sort of like beauty and aesthetic, but of that kind of sung, vocalized quality, maybe. Um, those are all things that we can expect a kind of an increase around with the North Node in Taurus. With the South Node in Scorpio, there's certain things that I associate with Scorpio. I mean, one thing Scorpio, strong association with sex and stuff like that. I kind of think of Scorpio as like, you know, getting dressed up in like leather and going out to a nightclub or something. You know what I mean? Like that seems to be like a Scorpio kind of like activity or a Scorpio style, a Scorpio flavor anyways, as opposed, like Taurus, you might be in your like your overalls, like you plowing the garden and like on a sunny day and stuff like that, whereas Scorpio, you're like having a cigarette in the leather jacket, or like I'm thinking more like I don't know. There's some sort of that Scorpio quality, however you define it, is going to be decreased while the South Node is in Scorpio, and so it's not. If you're planning on doing scorpionic things, this may not be the best time for it. I assume there's probably some other Scorpio qualities, such as Scorpios have a reputation for holding grudges and stuff like this, and so a positive thing could be that could be opening up and not holding on to grudges and not being whatever that kind of moody Scorpio resentment and those kind of emotions that could go with Scorpio could be toned down a bit, which could be a benefit. So that's kind of like generally how I view the flavor of this stuff. But I think that it'll be good to get to do this video where I look at each of the signs in particular, because by applying this to the houses, um, yeah, it kind of comes to life more than just trying to interpret what the nodes in these signs mean without applying them in context to what does it mean for your life if you have this chart or that chart, that kind of thing. Of course, if you know how to actually read your own chart and then read transits, then that's even better, right? But for right now, I'm just going to be doing a really basic thing where I go through um, each of the signs and talk about how this nodal shift will affect them. Now, and I guess one last thing I should mention is that when I do these horoscope videos, I my technique is to use the rising sign, because the rising sign sets up all the different houses. There is, like most people, when you look at your horoscope column in the newspaper, I think the tendency is to like look at the sign that represents your sun sign, and that is not necessarily a mistake or necessarily wrong, but it's using a technique called derived houses, in which you are treating the sun sign as if it's the first house and then deriving the rest of the horoscope from that. And I am not going to tell you not to do that, but in case you're wondering how I put these together, I'm using this house system with each sign as the rising sign, and it may work better if you just use your rising sign rather than your sun sign for this. But if you want to look at both, or even if you want to just look at one of these things as being your sun sign, I don't know. I mean, try it out and see if it's relevant or not. But yeah, I think the technique is maybe a little bit more pure if you just use your rising sign. But it's up to you. You can experiment if you want, I guess. Okay. Now, with all that said, I think with this one I might not even go into. I might not even throw the chart up on the screen, because I mean we only have to look at one thing, which is the nodes here, so it's not really that much to visualize. So with that all said, let's get started with Aries. Right. I have my book here in which I've made some notes. So With an Aries rising chart, Taurus is the second house and Scorpio is the eighth house. So you can expect an increase of second house and a decrease of eighth house topics. Second house largely has to do with making money, so it could be a good time for financial independence or for having lots of opportunities for making money or doing business. Um, the second house also has to do with belongings and what you own and the resources that you have to support yourself. So there's another, I mean, with the North Node representing a general increase, um, you could see an increase of material stuff, or maybe there could be a risk of maybe even having a collector attitude where you're like collecting and hoarding lots of material stuff, or somehow you just wind up with a bunch of stuff. Like maybe somebody gives you a bunch of stuff. Um, with the south node in the eighth house I generally view as relating to things like dependency and debt and stuff like that. So there, with the south node in the eighth house, it's like a good opportunity to sort of clear your debts, clear your dependencies, become more independent. Aries is a pretty independent kind of sign, anyways. So this kind of transit might just continue to support that. I guess another thing I should say is that the second house and the eighth house are both known as idle houses. Um, second house stands for making money, but it also could stand for money that you've already made and like what you have in the bank. And if you are in a position where you actually maybe the last few years have been really good with for you and you have a lot of money, then you might be in a position where you don't have to work very much because you have it, and then such. That's why it's known as an idle house, because it's not really active. It's like, oh, I can just sort of live off this for a while. That's another possibility, maybe. Um, and I mean, I think the eighth house. There's certain eighth house things like substance use and dependency and that, and so it could be a good time to sort of like get clear from that stuff. I do think that the south node can represent a tendency to sort of fall back on old habits. So there may be, that might also be a kind of a temptation, is to kind of regress and go back to some old kind of dependency. Um, that I think I've noticed that as another self node kind of thing as well. Even though it tends to be moving more in the direction of an increase of second house stuff, you might kind of like fall back on old habits with the self node, maybe. Okay, I think that's good for Aries. I'll move on now to Taurus. Okay, so Taurus, um, North node in first house, South node in seventh house. Actually, I think I'm gonna maybe I'll whatever. So, in a Taurus rising chart, the North Node has just moved into Taurus, so that the North Node is going to be affecting the first house, which is all about the self, and the seventh house is all about the other, and that's where the South Node is entered. So, if the North Node represents an increase of the self, um, there's a certain risk that I would see here. The concern is whether or not you're allowing yourself to become self-centered, self-absorbed. And I mean, I think an argument could be made on whether this is a general problem in our society, in general, of sort of narcissistic self-absorption. But for the context of astrology, we're talking about this period of 18 months that has just started now as being a particular time for Taurus rising people, um, in which the self concern, where you're kind of your own everything, there's a risk of not being able to see other people, not being able to if you're overly concerned with your own challenges, you may come off as being a bit of a jerk if you're unable to sympathize or relate with the challenges of others, and you place your own stuff as being more important than that. That if you're more or caught up in your own ups and downs and wins and losses, and or maybe inflated if you're doing well, or woe is me if you're not doing well, but either of those, it could be a kind of self-absorption, and I think that is primarily part of the problem with the North Node in the first house. With the other side of that, with the South Node in the seventh house, is that there's a sense of loss or decrease when it comes to the other or your relationships or your partnerships. So it's not exactly a time of what I would be expecting, a good year for relationships, for a good year for partnerships. Um, and I think that there could be a certain, maybe perhaps the absence of relationships, the absence of partnerships could contribute to the imbalance where you're thinking only of yourself and your own needs and being selfish and such. Um, and so that's kind of something, yeah, that's basically the gist that I get from this dynamic. Um, you could you could try to positivize it by talking about like work on yourself, stay in your own lane, self-development and all this kind of stuff. But I don't necessarily treat the nodes, even the North Node, as being a good thing, or I don't subscribe to the idea that the North Node is your purpose, some sort of higher purpose or direction in life, but rather that it creates a kind of increase, a kind of inflation, or that they're two poles of a magnet kind of thing. And that, yeah, when you put that magnet in the first house, this is what we're looking at as a result. Um, okay, I think that's good for Taurus. For Gemini rising, the North Node has moved into Taurus, which is the 12th house relative to Gemini, and the South Node has moved into Scorpio, which is the 6th house relative to Gemini. And this is actually, it's an interesting one, I think, because the 6th house, which is Scorpio for a Gemini rising, represents things such as health problems, tedious grunt work, getting into fights with people. That's kind of the gist of the 6th house. It's not seen as a very good house. It's seen as a place of bad fortune. That's what it's treated as in traditional astrology. So when you have the South Node, which represents a decrease in the house of bad fortune, that is actually a kind of a good thing, because all the bad stuff that we associate with the 6th house, which could be like injuries, getting sick, having a lot of work to do, it's going to be a decrease of all that kind of stuff, which I would take as good news. However, the 12th house has the North Node in it, and the 12th house represents basically isolation. There's a kind of, some people will go into a spiritual connotation with the 12th house, but I generally take that as being related to the idea that a monk will separate himself from society and live in a monastery. And I remember the early desert fathers, these early Christians, would totally separate themselves from society and go live in a monastery in the middle of the desert to sort of detach themselves from worldly life. And that kind of thing I would associate with a North Node in the 12th house, as it represents a kind of an increase of an isolating circumstance. And some people, not everybody is spiritually inclined, so some people may just take it as a tough, isolating time and not get the benefits of self-reflection, contemplation, looking inside, all this kind of stuff that go with the 12th house. Um, the 12th house can be tough in a way, right? Like, it's not an active house. It's not like you're doing a lot of hard physical work or anything like the 6th house, but it's work. Yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting. It's an interesting dynamic where the 6th house has to do with hard physical work, and you're going to Gemini rising is going to be getting a break from that. But can you imagine hard work in another way, where instead of doing hard work like scrubbing the floors, you know, doing the dishes and all this kind of stuff, that you have less of that to do, that your load has been lightened, but the fact of being isolated and being alone with yourself itself is a kind of a work that, maybe I'm of the opinion that there is actually a benefit to be gained from this, but it's not a benefit that you don't gain unless you work for it, right? Like, it's not like that an increase of 12 healthy stuff, even though it's a negative house. I think has a potential, to unlock that kind of dreamy spiritual side of the 12th house, but it's not something that's just going to be given to you. I don't think you have to actually kind of embrace the 12th house in order and not be at conflict with it, not be fighting against it. Speaking of conflict, I'm looking at my notes here. I mean, like this, yeah, the 6th house represents, conflict and fighting with others and stuff like that. So the idea here is you're going to have less conflicts with other people, and you may have a chance for more inner peace and more, like it's like a meditation retreat or something like that almost, right? But it's only a meditation retreat if you are able to take that attitude towards it to really get the benefit. Now, I mean, it could also just be the North Node and the South Node. It could also just be an increase of isolating circumstances more than what you would like, and maybe you'd be up for taking, doing some more, grunt work, doing more chores, that kind of thing. But this is what you're getting served up this year to deal with. Um, I suppose the other thing with the South Node and 6th house is warning to be careful not to neglect your health, because I would say if there's a lot of with a decrease of sixth house stuff may also be kind of like a decrease of getting exercise or a decrease of being active. So that's one thing to be careful for, is to not make sure you don't just get lazy or something like that. There may be less stuff that you have to do, but you may have more opportunity to be like, I'm going to go out and get a walk, or I'm going to go out and do some things I don't have to get a job done, but I'm going to do this activity for my own health. And it's good to remember to keep doing that stuff, because that's one of the helpful things about the 6th house that you don't want to lose with the South Node there. So Cancer rising, the North Node is in Taurus, which is the 11th house relative to Cancer. And the South Node is in Scorpio, which is the 5th house relative to Cancer. Now, the 5th house generally has to do with children, as well as like having fun and playing and stuff like that. But I think because Cancer often has a very strong parent-child association of like mothering and stuff like that, it's interesting for me to see the South Node in the 5th in a Cancer chart, because it represents a decrease of topics relating to children, and it could also be a decrease of some other stuff like as well. But the increase is in the 11th house, which has to do with your networking, being a part of groups and organizations and stuff like that. And what the general image that I get for this one is of a kind of a parental figure who is now spending less time with their kids and is moved back into kind of adult society and is maybe has some opportunities for networking and making some new career connections and stuff like that, which could be kind of atypical for the image that we typically have of Cancer. um, at least I associate them more of the kind of the nurturing, working with children type, but here there's actually a decrease of that and more of like the more of an increase of the kind of adult world of not necessarily doing business itself because that's more of a 10th house thing, but the adult world of making the connections. And I mean, it would, it could be an increase of things like um, Cancer rising may find an increase of ambition, goal setting, trying to work towards success. These are all kind of 11th house material. It's not so much the actual work, perhaps, but the setting of the goal, the laying out of the path, the drawing in of support, trying to accomplish something. But it's pragmatic. It's not. You have a loss of the stuff that's just for play, just for fun, just having a good time. It looks like You're there's more of like trying to get organized to do something more serious for Cancer. That is the general image that I have of the nodes in relation to Cancer. Leo rising. The 10th house is Taurus, so that's where the north node is. The 4th house is Scorpio, that's where the south node is. So, the 10th house, as I'm sure you are well aware if you are up on your astrology, has to do with career. It has to do with the daily grind. It has to do with getting stuff done and how you spend your time during the day. And it's an active house because it's an angular house. So, with the North Node transiting an angular house, the 10th house for Leo risings, I expect it's going to be perhaps a more busy year. It may be a year where you have more work opportunities. You may see increases in or advancements in your career and stuff like that. Um, there may be things that you accomplish, you get the job done this year. Um, it's it's a productive time. If anything, I'd be concerned that you might be too busy. What the South Node in the 4th house represents is the 4th house is your home life, your private life. It's the physical property that you reside upon, as well as it represents your family, where you come from, your roots, your ancestry, etc. And if there's a decrease there, that could mean that there's a decrease related to all those things. Especially when it comes to the eclipses tend to signify beginnings and endings in certain areas, so that there could be um, beginning and endings around career and work on one hand, and beginnings and endings around family and housing and living situation on the other. The Where there's an increase with the north node, there's a decrease with the south node. So I don't want to be making gloomy predictions that are totally set in stone, but I mean, one of the things that I could see would be a loss of a family member. With the 4th house, it's more like a parental figure specifically. Like there could be a loss of some kind of parental figure. There could be a kind of a loss of like family home or place you're residing. Um, there could be, you could also, I mean, it could just be that you're spending a lot less time at home and that you're really busy and you're out working a lot too. So that could be, there's a loss of a sense of time spent at home, time spent with the family, and more of just a busy kind of active time. That is the general picture that I'm getting for Leo rising chart. In a Virgo rising chart, the North Node is in the 9th house and the South Node is in the 3rd house. So the North Node is in Taurus, 9th house, which has to do with things like travel, religion, spirituality, education, higher education specifically. Now, I don't know what the year 2022 has in store in terms of coronavirus restrictions and stuff like that, but um, ninth house has to do with things, first of all, like traveling, specifically long distance. Like with ninth house, it doesn't mean, just taking a day trip somewhere. It's more like going to the other side of the world. So for some Virgo risings, this may apply in an increase of demand for you to travel or to make a kind of a pilgrimage or something. Um, there's also, there's also just a topic in general of spirituality and religion. If you consider yourself to be a kind of a spiritual type of person, it could be an increased focus this year. And school, it could be something where you're busy with schoolwork, or that education is a very strong focus for you. The ninth house kind of has this scholarly academic kind of thing going on to it, where it may not even be the most practical kind of schooling, but it could even be like really advanced academic stuff maybe. Virgo has that whole thing about the librarian cliche, so that maybe the increase in the ninth house is a good academic year for the geekier academic Virgos out there. The South Node is in the 3rd house, and the 3rd house has to do with your siblings, your neighbors, your neighborhood, that kind of stuff. So I don't know if you're a Virgo rising and you've got strong relationships with your siblings, that may not be as an important influence, or it may not be taking such a center stage. There may be a sense of loss or decrease around it. And I'm thinking if you tie it back in with the stuff of like, well, I don't know how many people are going to the pub or anything like that anyways, but I would consider, like going off and having a beer with your buddies at the pub to be a kind of a 3rd house activity. Whereas if you can't do that because you have to study, and then that is more of a 9th house activity. That's kind of one of the images that I have, is that there's going to be less. But with the whole pandemic and stuff, I don't know how much of that kind of just like socializing with your neighbors has really been that much of a there's been a kind of a decrease for everybody on that kind of stuff, or at least I'd imagine. For Virgo people in particular, that whole thing about having a friendly thing with your neighbors and stuff like that is going to be subject to some decrease, and the increase is going to be in more of like some kind of heady academic work, or doing your PhD or something like that, or it may be something religious or spiritual if that's what you're into. For some people, maybe it's traveling, but there's going to be like, if you go, like you go traveling, you're not seeing the people in your little neighborhood for a while. If you're going on a big adventure, you're not going to be seeing the brothers and sisters as indicated by the 3rd house as much. So that's the general kind of shift, is that you're going for, the scope is taking you out of this sort of neighborhood lifestyle kind of thing that is associated with the 3rd house, and more of an increase with ninth house topics. Libra rising. So you've got North Node in the 8th house of Taurus, and you've got the South Node in the 2nd house of Scorpio, relative to a Libra rising chart. Now, I'm Scorpio rising, so I just went through something like this the last 18 months. Um, so I, but basically, the way I interpret this one is that I look at the eighth house as having to do with things like dependency, and I look at the second house as having to do with your ability to support yourself, be independent, make money, that kind of thing. So basically, the gist of it is that it may be a challenging year to be independent, to make money for yourself, and that there's certain eighth housey things that may have an increased influence, such as if you are dependent on other people, like if you, I mean, there's all some degree of dependency. Like, I know that the cost of living is tough for a lot of people in a lot of places, and in order to make it work, we need to live with other people, we need to live with roommates, stuff like that. And it can be not the best situation because, you want to be you we want to be independent and not be tied to what's going on with another person. Because if something messes up with the other person, then we go down too, kind of thing, right? So dependency is generally not seen to be as a very it's something that's discouraged in our society, but unfortunately in when you've got the north node in the eighth house and you've got the south node in the second house, it's like I kind of take it as this lesson that like dependency is there. It's not like an absolute value, like it's evil to be independent and it's virtuous to be independent, but that there's a certain time when dependency is appropriate. There's a certain time when it's helpful to have someone to lean on. There's certain times when it's like, thank God I have this thing to support me. And like in my own chart, I've got Chiron in the eighth house, and one of the things that I've been dealing with is that like I'm on a disability pension personally. So I mean, like I don't even make my own money pretty much. I get money from the government for my disability kind of thing. And so if you're the kind of person for if you would qualify for that kind of thing, I think having something like a disability pension or welfare or I don't know. I mean, we're at like what year 3 of the coronavirus pandemic. I don't know what kind of benefits people get, but those kinds of things, I mean, yeah, they can be really helpful. I mean, because I mean, what's the alternative? It's like going into debt, basically, and that's going into debt because another really eighth house thing. Like if you have trouble making money yourself, if you have trouble paying the bills, and you have to, you know, go turn to loans and credit cards and stuff like that. I mean, I've been careful to stay out of debt my life. I mean, I've instead of going to debt, my whole thing has been to sort of like get into whatever having disability payments support me and stuff like that. But so you make it's basically, I mean, everybody's got a bit of a different situation. What this kind of dependency increase of the eighth house looks like could be a bit different for everybody. But that's how I view it. I also look at addictions and substance dependencies as also being very eighth house material. So that I mean that's another thing to be careful of if you're you know, sometimes we might turn to drugs and alcohol to ease the discomfort or to ease the stress that comes when we know we're not in a position to support ourselves and we may just self medicate or something like that and then, become further dependent on substances or further unable to be independent and support ourselves. So that's might be our something to watch out for as well. Um, with the South Node in the second house, I do also think that the South Node can be like something that you fall back on, is the term that I'm using, in the sense that, like maybe you're feeling down because you're not having the kind of cash flow or whatever, you're having problems with your business or your work and you're feeling that, but it's like there's a, there could be, like, you're feeling this void that or something like that, and you want to fill the void with material things, so you like fall back on, like, retail therapy or like a shopping addiction. Like, you don't have the money to spend, but you want to make yourself feel better and buy yourself something nice and stuff like that. And then that could be a kind of a self node behavior, is like using the material possession thing of the second house as being, like you're feeling the absence of having a good cash flow, but that's what you want. You want to be able to have money and just buy what you want or have a material, comfortable life. So you try to do that, even though if you don't have the resources for it. And then maybe you put it on your credit card and you've got a big credit card debt to pay off. Like that's the kind of stuff that I would say to watch out for if you're a Libra rising for the next 18 months. And that the eclipses may have to do with these kind of topics for you. Okay. For Scorpio rising, the south node is in the first house and the north node is in the seventh house. So the seventh house has to do with relationships and partnerships and all that kind of stuff. And the north node represents an increase. So I think it's fair to expect an increase on relationship stuff for Scorpio rising. And I think it even fits with the astrology, because if you take this transit, the north node in Taurus, and you turn back the clock to when that happened last time, what you get, I'm just going off memory here, so excuse me if my dates are wrong, but from when I was looking at this before, the last time Taurus rising was in, the last time the North Node was in Taurus was in around 2004, and personally, that was around the time when I was involved in my major relationship of my kind of like teenage years. And looking back on it, it was actually, I thought it was a pretty good relationship. Although, I think that when the North Node is in the seventh house and when the South Node is in the first house, the relationship itself may not have any problems, but I think there's a problem that can come when you're getting too wrapped up in the relationship to the point where you experience a kind of a loss of your own self. And the South Node represents a decrease, and the South Node is going to be in the first house of Scorpio rising, that you could be in a relationship and all your attention and energy is going into that relationship. And some people even talk about it as in terms of like there being a third entity that's created by the relationship. That's like it's both people are creating a relationship entity kind of thing, right? Now, when the relationship is over, it can be completely devastating if you have invested all of your sense of self into the role that you play in that relationship. If you've invested your identity into being, I am this person who's defined by having this other person as my partner and the life that we have together and all the things that we do together, etc., etc. There's a risk there that if you get so involved in that kind of thing, maybe you guys get married and it goes on and on and on, and you don't have to deal with loss for quite a while. But in some cases, people may, I think generally what I've learned in my life is it's not a question of if, it's not a question of if loss happens. because loss is inevitable, because that's just the nature of life in the sense that it's a transient experience that we're having, that we live in a kind of a narrative situation where life has beginning, a middle, and an end. You're born, you live, and you die. And then the things that happen in our lives have beginning, middles, and endings. So that relationships often do not stand the test of time. And then even the ones that do stand the test of time, if you fulfill your vow of, till death do us part, then in many cases, death does do you part, right? And so the whole point is that everything is impermanent, and that if you're wrapped up in your relationship and it's over, then who are you without that relationship? And I think that's the main thing to remember. The good news. I'm kind of funny. It's funny for me to do this because I'm Scorpio rising myself. Because it's funny for me to prophesize for myself that it's going to be an active year for relationships. Because at the moment, aside from my ex-girlfriend continuously harassing me, I don't have any prospects lined up for me. It's looking pretty quiet right now. But I'm here as an astrologer, and this is basically what I have laid out to look at, is that it's a year that has a similar dynamic to my first major experience in a relationship when I was 17 years old or whatever. So it's there's a certain sense of expectation and such. And if you're the kind of person who likes getting into relationships, this could all be very good news, actually. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer by talking about loss and impermanence and all this kind of stuff. The point, though, is that the South Node in the first house represents a sense of getting completely lost in the relationship, completely getting lost in this dynamic with another person, and that it's good to try to retain a sense of your own self, a sense of your own life, because if it doesn't go the distance, or if you face that inevitable impermanence of it, then you're going to have to find yourself again coming out of it. And if the relationship doesn't last forever, then it's like the relationship can come and go without you feeling like you've had your whole life destroyed, basically. So that's my tips for Scorpio risings. For a Sagittarius rising, you've got Taurus in the 6th house. That's where the North Node has just moved. And you've got Scorpio in the 12th house, and that's where the South Node has just moved. Now, the 6th house stands for things such as health and wellness, busy work, kind of menial manual labor, and it can also stand for things like getting to fights and stuff like that. Now, this may seem like a diverse kind of range of topics, but the basic premise here is, what can I say? Let's say you get an infection, or let's say you get the coronavirus or something like that, and your immune system fights it off. That there's a kind of a fighting kind of quality to winning the war against an infection. And if you are, if we go take a step back and it's not about fighting off an infection, we can talk about, let's just say, in generally good physical health, being active and exercising and working out and stuff like that. It's sort of similar in a way to fighting off an infection, because you're making yourself work, right? You're getting your blood flowing, you're being active, and there's also this quality, though, that you have to keep doing it to keep yourself. You can't just stop. You have to keep being active and doing stuff. And so there might be things like manual labor, physical work that's not very much fun, but if you do a lot of that stuff, you will become strong, you'll become healthy, and all that. Well, okay, the North Node is in the sixth house, which pertains to all of that stuff. So it's, I would say, it's a good year for whatever exercise, for working out, for physical health and wellness. However, there's some things to look out for because it's like I think I can't remember if I'm almost thinking about Bill Hicks making a joke about people who jog having health problems or something. But there's one of the things that goes with let's say you really embrace it and you become an athlete. One of the things about being an athlete is that the more active and athletic you are, you also put yourself at risk to injury. Now, and depending, I don't need to get into all this stuff, right? I mean, you understand that basic principle. I don't have to explain all the injuries that come with different activities and stuff like that. So there could be an increase of activity, but there could be injuries that come with that. But it's not like you're going to be unhealthy due to lack of activity. If anything, you're going to be very active and getting in shape, and there might be bumps on the road with that. It may not be. It could be a good omen, perhaps, for having a good immune system. I mean, don't take my word for it. I would have to look at your own chart or whatever, but like, it's like with a north node in the sixth house, it's like rather than avoiding infections, like get it like viral infections or bacterial infections or whatever, it's like you get the infection but you fight it off. You get the infection but you have a healthy immune system. This is what sixth house stuff kind of stands for, right? It's both the infection and the ability to recover from it. And so with the north node there, you're probably more likely to get the infection, but you also have a good odds of beating it and staying healthy and all this kind of stuff. To contrast this, the south node is in the 12th house, and the 12th house has to do with things like hospitals and prisons and being isolated and stuff like that. Now, again, this is a kind of good news because the south node decreases what's going on in the 12th house. And a very mundane way to look at this is that if you do get sick, if you do get infections, your time where you're immobilized, stuck in a hospital bed or whatever, is reduced by that self node influence. So, like, it's a good, I mean, it's as far as as far as nodal things go, it's actually a pretty good one. Um, I have my notes that it's kind of like it's almost like a whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of attitude towards this kind of stuff. And the thing is, like, we are going to be having eclipses in these signs, so I don't treat it as just being strong and powerful. That it may be something to look into closer to the eclipse, but things might really get thrown out of whack around the eclipses. Like maybe you do really get ill, but you get over it, or there's some big injury that comes as part of your athletic regime or something. That could have to do with the actual eclipse itself, maybe. So I don't want to be too positive. There could be challenges, but it's generally more like the north node in the sixth house is like having the strength to overcome those challenges. If there's anything that I would caution about for Sagittarius, is that one of the things, to go with all this stuff, like the sixth house has to do with fighting off infections. One of the things that the sixth house stood for traditionally was, it was like getting attacked. It was like if you're getting jumped by robbers or muggers or something like that. Or, I mean, it could also just be a verbal argument, a quarrel or something. Is that you might be feeling tough, that you can overcome the obstacles, that you can stay in shape but like you might be confrontational and you might get into fights with other people. You might be like, you know, or fight with, I can fight the virus. I don't need the vaccine. And then I'll also fight everybody that takes the vaccine. And I'll just, that you're going to be a shit disturber and you're going to cause trouble or something. I don't know. I don't want to bring all this vaccine stuff into it. I don't know. My point here is not to get into like vax politics with this one way or the other, but it kind of the North Node in the sixth house kind of goes with this thing of like somebody who is tough and they're building up their immune system, and that kind of that's how I read it. Okay, so that's enough for Sagittarius rising. Okay, for Capricorn, the North Node is in the fifth house of Taurus, and the South Node is in the 11th house of Scorpio. I thought this was a kind of a funny one because Capricorn, the usual stereotype that we have for Capricorn is that they're very hardworking, serious kind of people. I mean, I don't know. Actually, thinking about the Capricorns I actually have met in my life, I don't know if I'd call them really that serious. I've met some pretty goofy Capricorns before. So maybe but it kind of goes with this transit because the North Node is in the fifth house relative to Capricorn rising, and the fifth house all has to do with play, having fun, goofing around. It also, on a more mundane level, relates to things involving children and childbirth and pregnancy and all that kind of stuff. So it could be, I mean, at the level of children and pregnancy and stuff like that, the North Node in the fifth house may have something to do with having more kids, or maybe spending time with kids, or if you're a parent, being more involved with your kids. But like there's a fun quality to it too, like playing games in the park with your kids, and it's not like serious work and stuff like that. So there's going to be an increase of all that kind of stuff. It could be good for creative things as well, because there's a spirit of play and childlike exploration and creativity and stuff. So I would see that as generally a good sign for Capricorn rising. The other hand of it is that the South Node is in the 11th house. So the 11th house has to do with more like groups and networking, organizations. It also has to do with sort of like working to achieve your aspirations and goals and stuff. It reminds me, like of a few years back. My ex-girlfriend took me to a party, but the party wasn't really a party. It was only a couple people, and it was an old friend of hers, and they were drinking for it wasn't New Year's, it was more like winter solstice, but they're doing a very New Year's-y. She was like drunk, and she wanted to do like goal setting, like set your goals for New Year's. And I don't know, man. Like I am the most I really don't like this goal setting stuff personally, but I like I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe this is a bit of a digression for Capricorn, but like this whole thing about working towards goals and achievement and progressing and stuff like that, it's not going to be the best time for it in terms of astrology with a South Node in the 11th house. I would say that it's a good time in terms of playing without an outcome in mind. That you're having this just open experimentation, open. Alan Watts talks about this thing about how there's not a purposeful objective to a dance. That you're not dancing to get from one side of the room to the other. That there's something about the dance which is expressive and playful, or it doesn't have to do with like achieving an outcome. And that Alan Watts talks about how life doesn't have to be about achieving a goal or an outcome. That it can be like your life can be like a ballet, or a beautiful song. And he talks about how a song isn't just about getting through the song and getting to the end of the song. It's about kind of lingering in the song, and you know what I mean. Like you're. So I mean, I think I would love to have a whatever. I mean, I shouldn't get into this, but I'm kind of digressing here a bit on the on Capricorn maybe, but the my general recommendation is, it's good time to like listen to some Alan Watts and get out of a goal oriented, outcome oriented attitude towards life and like smell the roses and have some fun and stuff like that. That's generally what I'm getting from this one for Capricorn. For Aquarius rising, the North Node is in Taurus, which is the fourth house relative to Aquarius, and the South Node is in the 10th house, which is Scorpio. Now, the 10th house has to do with work, your career, being famous. It's like kind of what you get known for, the mark you leave, the pinnacle of your achievement, and all this kind of stuff. And the fourth house has more to do with your home life, your private life, your family, your ancestry. And when the South Node is in the 10th house, it means there's going to be generally a lot less activity in that area. So if you're an Aquarius rising, I would not go into the next 18-month period with an expectation of having a very active career or work life or making a lot of progress in those areas, because if anything, that's if you feel like that, you're probably just going to get disappointed and frustrated. The North Node is in the fourth house, which has to do with home life and family. And I mean, if you weren't already spending a lot of time at home due to the situation with the pandemic, you could expect to be spending a lot of time at home. I don't know, that's probably not going to be that comforting to people, I imagine, but that's the situation. Um, there's also, of course, the fourth house stands for family, so there could be an increase of contact with family or time spent with family, dealing with family stuff, or dealing with home stuff as well, which could have to do with the actual physical house itself and the problems in that house. If like you have like, I don't know, home maintenance problems to deal with, that could be something to take a look at. Um, my own mother has been getting very involved with the stuff like ancestry.com and stuff, and tracking her ancestry out and documenting her ancestry, and that is another thing that could be an interest or an increased point of focus when the North Node is transiting the fourth house, as it would be for Aquarius rising. Um, Now, I also kind of view the fourth house as being a kind of a place of rest. It's an angular house, which like the angular houses are generally seen to be active houses, but because the fourth house is at the very bottom of the chart, it's at the very nighttime kind of place, that I kind of see the North Node in the fourth house relative to Aquarius as being an increase of rest as opposed to the decrease of work associated with the South Node in the 10th house. So there'll be maybe less time being out there in society getting stuff done, and maybe an 18-month period to sort of rest and recuperate. And I think you could also look at fourth house significations of family as being a kind of support for that kind of thing, that oftentimes we come back home as a place to sort of rest and recuperate, not as a place to do our life's work, so to speak, right? Is they're kind of seen as polar opposite kind of it's kind of the fourth house is kind of the foundational structure that provides a kind of a respite rather than what you're pouring your energy into. Um, right. So that's my take on this one for Aquarius rising. For Pisces rising, the North Node is going to be in the third house of Taurus rising, and the South Node is going to be in the ninth house. Sorry, I said Taurus rising. I'm just throwing the word rising in there when I shouldn't. The third, sorry, I'll just do this over again. The North Node will be in the third house of Taurus, and then South Node will be in the ninth house of Scorpio. Now, the ninth house has to do with religion, spirituality, higher learning, like university education, that kind of stuff, as well as travel. And the South Node there represents a general decrease of all these things. So, with that said, it's probably not the best period of time, these 18 months coming up, but to be doing things that involve going to school, traveling and stuff like that. If you have Pisces rising, when I'm trying to understand what the South Node in the ninth house means, one of the things that came to mind is letting go in terms of your held beliefs and principles. Like, I see the ninth house as being the kind of the guiding principles of your life, that you're looking for something to aim for, like some sort of like higher value. Like, this is another thing, is that people have said that, like, the second house has to do with belongings, material possessions, your valuables, but they say, it could be what you value, what your values are. I am going to make a distinctive stand here and say that your values, if you're talking about your principles, as in the guiding principles that you like, I value kindness and being a kind person, and I will aim to be kind in my interactions with other people's. That's ninth house. That's not second house. That's what I would see it. Your what you because that's kind of like your higher guiding principle is a ninth house kind of thing. The second, but I mean, I'm not. This whole point of this is not for me to talk about house topics. I'm giving like for Pisces here, so I won't get too far into that conversation. But I am with your guiding principles that have how you navigate your life. The South Node is going to be affecting that, so it's an opportunity for you to kind of not be too hung up on what you believe in as your principles, and instead, where do you have the North Node? You have the North Node in the third house, which has to do with things like siblings, which has to do with things like neighbors, which has to do with things like aunts and uncles or people, in the community and stuff like that. And in a Pisces chart, that is associated with Taurus. So, Taurus is an earth sign, so there's a certain grounding quality, I feel, like this. Whereas the ninth house is kind of lofty with a kind of idealism, that there's a kind of like coming down to earth and dealing with your neighbors, dealing with your brothers and sisters in a relational kind of sense. It's like it's grounding, but it's also relational. And you may have to let go of these things that you put on a pedestal as some high ideal to believe in. Like, you may have to come down off your high horse, so to speak, so that you can immerse yourself with the common people. You know what I mean? Like, it could be a kind of an ego check, maybe even for the Pisces rising person. Now, The thing though is that I also don't view the nodes as being like your life purpose is the north node or something. That there's something that makes the north node better or something like that. It could just be that you have an increase of activity in the third house. So there's an increase of focus on things like neighbors, siblings, communication at like kind of everyday life kind of level that we associate with the third house. And a decrease of this sort of more lofty spiritual thing that with the ninth house, or of some sort of, trying to get your PhD or something like that, or your university degree or whatever. It's like it's kind of coming back to earth, the salt of the earth. I really get from the this effect on the Pisces chart. But I think like the self node is often something that you kind of fall back on, so that if you're having a hard time with the sort of grounded relational thing of a Taurus third house, you may fall back on a kind of spiritual idealism because that's what you're kind of comfortable with. I think that is some way that the self node does work, perhaps. Maybe it's more of a modern interpretation. I don't know, but you know, it's more about it may be more the north node may be more challenging. That's another thing that I think may be valid for modern astrology. But I don't necessarily see the north node as being like that's where the guiding purpose necessarily is. But there will be an increase with that third house stuff and a decrease with that ninth house stuff, and you're gonna have to deal with it. That's my take on what it means for a Pisces rising. Okay, well, I think I kind of went over everything that I had to say about the north nodes in my introduction, so I don't really have much to say at the end here, at least not that's coming to mind at this point in time. So that said, this is my video on the Nords. The Nords. I've got a Nord keyboard of the nodes moving into Scorpio and Taurus. Hope you liked it. Please like and subscribe, etc. You can find me on Facebook at Divine Timing and Divine Timing Divination Astrology. Um, yeah, have a good one, guys.